Hi everyone, this is Kelly, a writing consultant with New Mexico State University's Online Writing Center. In this video, I'm going to discuss a few strategies to help you read complex texts. If you're a student, I hope this video introduces you to a few questions you can ask yourself as you read. If you're an instructor, I hope this video identifies a few ways you can articulate to your students various purposes and processes of reading, beyond reading for information. Specifically, I'll review 3 approaches to reading and strategies for annotating that support reading comprehension. I'll demonstrate these strategies on a recent journal article called Cites of Normalcy, Understanding Online Education as Prosthetic Technology. Then I'll discuss how these reading strategies support you as a writer. First, what do I mean by reading? Reading is more than reviewing a text for information, which is perhaps how you might read textbooks. Though you might be tested on or give a test to recall information, this approach is rather limiting to what you'll learn from the text. You're only banking information instead of developing as a reader, writer, and thinker. When we read critically, we ask questions that allow us to interact with the text in complex ways. As you develop as a student and as a professional, you'll be expected to produce your own texts for your teachers or supervisors, and you can learn how to compose these texts through reading. The goal for reading then becomes a little different. Your attention turns not only to what the writer writes, but also how she writes it. In just a minute, we'll turn our attention to other questions you can ask yourself as you read and review strategies for reading and annotating difficult texts. But second, what do I mean by annotating? It's important as you annotate or make notes on the text as you read to do more than simply highlight or underline the text. Doing this brings attention to the idea, but underlining and highlighting don't require you to understand the idea. If you prefer highlighting or underlining as you read, I encourage you to also include a short note for each highlight or underline you make, and this note could tell you why you're highlighting or underlining this particular section. Is it an important quote, a helpful example, an idea you don't quite understand and want to return to? Regardless of why you're marking it, leave yourself some notes so when you return to the reading, you know why you marked the text. One type of marginal note that I strongly encourage is to paraphrase the idea you are marking. By putting the idea into your own words, even if it's just a few keywords, facilitates comprehension since you have to understand the idea well enough to put it into your own words. So now that I've briefly explained my 2 key points, reading and annotating, in the rest of the video, I'll discuss a few reading and annotating strategies to support reading comprehension, and we'll do this by looking at an actual article. The first reading strategy I'll discuss asks you to distinguish between what the writer claims and what or who the writer is referencing. Oftentimes, readers will attribute an idea to the writer just because the idea is in the text, when the writer is in fact referencing someone else. Let's look at an example from our text. This is the example article we'll look at. In this first paragraph, the writers discuss the conversations that are happening in the field of disability studies and online education, and they cite the writers attributed to those conversations. We see that here. Here's a claim, and here are the authors who are making those claims. Recognize, though, that the writers aren't making these claims themselves, but are showing that others are doing that work. We see that through the in-text citations. This is a more obvious example of writers citing others, so let's look at another. Scroll down about a page in. In this section, Normalcy and in Online Education, they address the work that others have done regarding the concept of normalcy. In the first sentence of the paragraph, we see their topic sentence, or the main idea of their paragraph, an idea that, since there is no mention or reference to another scholar, we know that they're claiming as their own. This is something that the writers are presenting themselves. They support this claim by citing Leonard Davis and explaining his concept of normalcy. I quote him here. Notice the language they use, Davis explains, to show their audience that this is Davis's idea and not their own. We also know in the next sentence that they are still referencing Davis, not because they mention him in the sentence, but because of the in-text citation at the end of the sentence. We know this is still Davis's idea because of the simple presence of the in-text citation, and since Davis was the most recent person they cited, we know that this citation is continuing to reference him. We see a similar pattern in the next paragraph where the authors introduce in their topic sentence, or in their first sentence, Davis's idea that normalcy as a construct doesn't just exist. So notice in this example, they're starting the paragraph by pulling in from an idea from somebody else and not their own. Okay, again, they take several sentences to support this idea, and they do so by citing Davis still. See a few sentences here that continue to cite Davis and explain his idea of normalcy as a construct. And then they move into citing another author, another scholar, J. Dolmage. Notice that Moeller and Jung are putting Davis and Dolmage in conversation with each other. See this through the sentence and as we transition into Dolmage's idea. So they're putting these two into conversation with each other in order to set the groundwork of normalcy as a construct and to bring them to their understanding and use of their idea, ideology of normalcy. So we see in the paragraph so far, they're pulling in authors to lay the groundwork of normalcy. They do that throughout the paragraph. And in this final sentence is where they present what this work means for their own projects. Turns to their idea of normalcy in online education. So they took a few paragraphs to lay the groundwork of normalcy. Since it is a central concept to their argument, they wanted to take time to explain what this means. And then they show how this concept is relevant for their own work in this final sentence. So again, be sure as you're reading that you distinguish between what the writers claim and what they are citing that others claim. We can let our annotations help us make these distinctions as we read. For example, this concept about normalcy seems important to understand, so I might want to mark this idea in the margin. So here's where we start to annotate. For the topic sentence, back up to the first paragraph we looked at, under the normalcy and in online education section, I might make an annotation that brings my attention to this idea of normalcy as a construct, or normalcy as an ideology. So here, just right next to this sentence, this idea in the margins, I might write something like normalcy equals an ideology, and this means, so what does this mean? So I'm writing systems designed to accommodate some, not all bodies. This annotation makes sense to me, and that is the point. I'm leaving myself a note that will help me understand the text and remind me why I marked that particular section. So the ways that you annotate should make sense to you, but the reason, instead of just simply highlighting that sentence, I'm pulling out some keywords, trying to digest that idea in order so that I understand it better. I might also want to mark the idea of normalcy as a construct, which we started to see in the second paragraph. Again, that seemed like another major idea since they took a full paragraph to explain what that meant. So again, I might make an annotation such as normalcy It's a construct. But here, since this isn't necessarily their idea, but they're pulling from Davis to explain this, I'm going to use my annotation to help me distinguish between what it is that the authors are saying and what it is that they're citing. So this idea of normalcy as a construct comes from Leonard Davis. So I want to make sure that in my note that I credit that idea to Davis and not to the authors, because that's where the idea comes from. So again, just distinguishing between what is it that the authors are saying and who it is that they are citing. The second reading strategy I'll review asks you to distinguish between what the text says and what the text does. Of course, the first part, identifying what the text says, requires reading comprehension, which this entire video is intended to instruct. The second part, identifying what the text does, asks you to think about the purposes and of the individual paragraphs and sentences and how they relate to other parts of the work. For example, you could ask yourself if the paragraph provides background context, if it explains the theory that's being applied, if it offers an example of the theory or the idea, if it addresses a counterclaim. All of these speak to what the paragraph is doing. So let's turn our attention to the text again, and we'll ask ourselves these two questions. What does the paragraph say, and what does the paragraph do? And I'll mark these distinctions in my annotations. So for example, if we come back up to this paragraph here, I might make a note that says, where I distinguish what the paragraph says, here I'm writing, the paragraph says that systems are developed with certain assumptions about normalcy and ability. In my understanding of the text, that's a quick summary or paraphrase, just capturing the main idea, what the paragraph is saying. I'll also write does. What is it doing? What larger purpose is it serving this article? In my opinion, it's introducing the idea of normalcy, not as something that naturally exists, but as ideology. So we're getting a little bit of what the text says, but as a way to support what is it doing. It's introducing this idea, okay, which later they build on this idea, but this is laying that groundwork. And I want to make sure that I can distinguish what is it saying, what is it doing. Okay, and those are two different points, but of course they overlap. Making myself aware of both what the text says and what it does helps me more thoroughly understand the ideas and how they relate to the previous and following sections. Also, as a writer, I might make a mental note of the work that needs to be done or the details in which concepts need to be explained or situated in order to lead into my use of those concepts. This is if I'm thinking about what does this mean for me as a writer? What are some things that I need to make sure that I do when I write? And something like introducing concepts and explaining what they mean, that might be a good strategy that I would use as a writer. Okay, going on to our next paragraph. Also to make this note, what it says and what it does. So here I'll write says. There seems to be a shift from this idea of the ideal to normal. And they explain this concept through by using a bell curve metaphor. That motivates people to fit in the middle, right? To make sure that they are accommodating themselves to fit into that curve, into the normal. So that's what the paragraph is saying. Here's what it does. In this paragraph, the paragraph reviews literature, especially Davis and Dolmage. The idea of normalcy as an ideological construct to lead to their idea of an ideology of normalcy. So in my opinion, that's what the paragraph is doing. It's doing this review work in order to bring them to their, bring it together in the end for their ideology of normalcy that they use throughout the rest of the article. And because that idea is so important, I might want to highlight this, this specific language, ideology of normalcy. So in this case, I'm going to actually highlight that. Again, anytime we highlight, we also want to make sure that we include a note as to why we are highlighting it, since it is a key concept to the article. So if I cite them later, I might want to quote this actual language, the actual language of their idea. So here I'm just telling myself why I'm highlighting it. It's a key concept or important language that they're using that I want to make sure that I capture. Finally, close rhetorical reading allows you to become aware of the text's rhetorical context. As a reader, recognizing the argument, purpose, methods of support, and target audience is important for reading comprehension and for you to think through why the writer made the content and design decisions that she made. Also, identifying the rhetorical context gives you specific goals or purpose as you read. So you have things that you're actually looking for as you read instead of just skimming the text for information. So let's turn to our text to see how we can identify this rhetorical context. This particular article makes our job of locating these features a little easier since the authors announce them in their introduction, in the second paragraph of their introduction. So their argument, in this paragraph, they present their argument here. Specifically, we argue that while online education can provide educational opportunities to people who might otherwise be denied access to them, the dynamics of online education mark both an online education and its users as less than substitutes for the real version. So here, a specific, concrete, direct sentence that captures their argument. So I want to make sure that I take note of that. So I'm going to note here, I actually highlight that as well. That way I see that this is their argument. So I'll make a note of this and provide a few keywords or paraphrase of what they are actually arguing. So I'll write argument, online ed dynamics, insufficient replacement for face-to-face classroom. Of course, it doesn't capture the full heart of the argument, but it gives me some keywords to keep in mind as I continue reading. Next, we want to ask ourselves how they support their argument. So what are the strategies that the authors use to support their argument? Again, these authors make our job of identifying that a little easy because they tell us exactly in the introduction how they are going to support their argument. They mention their methods of support here. So again, I might highlight this. And then again, include another note. So I might write here methods of support. Use disability studies scholarship to read how narratives construct and circulate ideology of normalcy. So again, I'm quoting that language here because that is specific language to their argument, and I want to make sure that I'm keeping it specific to their article and that I'm not using it as my own language. So it's just nice to get into that habit of quoting that kind of specific language. Now, since not all articles will announce how they will support their argument in their introduction, we might not know an author's methods of support in the introduction. Instead, we might have to answer this question as we read the article. So we'll go through as we're reading. We'll know, oh, they're using citing scholarship in this area. Maybe another section they provide examples to demonstrate their ideas. Maybe there are a few sections where they introduce counterclaims. But we can, as we're reading through, we can identify the methods that they use to support their argument. Then we'll want to determine the purpose of the article, or what the authors are trying to accomplish in this in their piece. So, again, in this article, they provide that nice work here. So by presenting their argument, by supporting it this way, here's they're saying their goal here. Okay, so I might want to highlight that. And I might annotate this as purpose to challenge ideas that online ed is adequate substitution for face-to-face classes. And to present online ed as a place to house disruptive or non-normal bodies. So that's the idea that I understand from this sentence. We'll also want to determine the audience of the piece. I often hear students say, well, the audience is everyone, but I don't think this is ever the case. We see the article is published in Disability Studies Quarterly, so perhaps the audience would be scholars in the field of disability studies. Also, since the argument addresses online education, we might see the audience as being academics involved with online teaching or course design. Regardless, the audience wouldn't be everyone. I don't think, for example, they are writing to my retired golf-playing father or to my 12-year-old niece. So narrow down the audience so you can think through why the authors make the design and content decisions they make. What assumptions are they making about their audience, about what the audience already knows, and how is that informing their language use, who they're citing, the arguments that they're making. So what does all of this mean for you as a writer? First, you can study texts to learn about the discourse community and its genres. Specifically, you can start to pick up the language, style, and methods that the discourse community values. You can also learn about the questions the community asks, what counts as evidence, and the community's values. So as you read, ask yourself what the text can tell you about the community and about the genre. Returning to our example, if I want to learn about the field of disability studies and/or topics in online education, I'll pay particular attention to who the authors cite, the types of questions they ask, the argument they form, and how they support their argument. That way I can keep these in mind, so when I begin writing my own projects for this particular discourse community, I can make sure my writing is within the scope of the field. So regarding genre awareness, you can also read to study the moves the writers make in this piece. If, for example, I'm interested in writing an article in this field of disability studies, or even for this journal, Disability Studies Quarterly, I can track the moves the writers make so I can make similar moves in my own writing. For example, I see they begin with a quick review of the scope of the field, the scope of scholarly conversations happening in disability studies and online education. From there, they identify a gap. Then they propose to fill that gap with their own project. This is a common sequence in academic articles. So if I were writing an article, I'd consider how I might make these similar moves. Identify the scope of the field, identify a gap, and propose my project to fill that gap. I also see the writers use subheadings to organize their ideas. And this might be a strategy that I employ in my own writing for a project that follows a similar genre for this particular discourse community. Taking another lead from this text, I might need to provide context for some of the terms I use, which we saw was their move up here. As we see in this paragraph, the authors introduce an idea, explain or situate it within research, and then explain the significance of the idea. Again, moves I might want to make if I were also wanting to write an academic article. The final implication for writers I'll address is reading to ask new questions. We don't want to read in order to find sources that support our own ideas. Rather, we read in order to find a gap, to ask a new question. This new question then becomes your research project. So after reading this article, I might ask questions that complicate or push back on the author's arguments or methods of support. Or I might consider how I could apply their argument to other situations. I might ask how their argument applies to hybrid classes, classes that meet online and in person, or how it applies to different types of courses. I might even take up their call in the conclusion to conduct case studies or ethnographic research to learn how actual people negotiate these spaces. Regardless, I can use the text to begin brainstorming ideas for my own project instead of making their work fit a project that simply agrees with what it is that they're writing. So I hope this video has helped you think about a few ways you can interact with the text to help you better understand it. So thanks for watching and happy reading and writing.